Welcome into the Dog Check Podcast, part of the Bleav network of podcasts, and also airing on Bally Sports Great Lakes. I'm Spencer German, excited to be back with you, rolling into week 2 of OTAs for the Cleveland Browns. Also, the calendar flipping to June this week, which I don't know about you guys, but this is when it really starts to kick in for me that we're almost back to football season, just a couple months away. This week on the show, I'm thrilled to be joined by PFF's Sam Monson here on the show. Sam, appreciate you jumping on and giving us some time, man. I don't know how you feel about this time of year, but am I wrong that it feels like football is just right around the corner once we get to June?
Yeah, I mean, it's starting to get there, all right. We only just finished the draft, so this is the sort of off season, such as it is for the NFL. You get straight into the off season with free agency, then straight into the draft, that whole sequence, and then you have the kind of week of let's evaluate the draft, let's grade it, let's break it all down, let's project forward. And then there's a little exhale where everyone gets a break for a week or two. But you're right. As soon as you start to get to June, and now it's OTAs and mini camps and training camp, and that's the start. It comes back again. You get that couple of weeks off, and here we go.
I want to start with you just kind of with a conversation that you were actually having with your podcast partner, Steve Palazzolo, about Deshaun Watson on the latest episode of the PFF NFL podcast that you guys do. And listen, everybody in Cleveland already knows at this point that 2024 is a massive season, a massive year for Watson. I think that goes without saying at this point. But you and Steve reflected on just the last time we saw Watson play at a high level was the COVID season, 2020. And I want to know, as you're watching his tape, as you're breaking things down and assessing his play and giving out grades like you guys do over at PFF over these last couple of years with the Browns, do you see remnants of that quarterback still being in there, or has that ship sailed, in your opinion?
You definitely see the occasional flash of it, but he hasn't looked like that guy at all. You know, anytime you have a quarterback with that much talent and that much ability, you're going to see the occasional flash in a play here or there that makes you go, okay, that player's still in there. It's not like we're dealing with somebody who, injuries have just taken everything away from him and he's not the same guy. And, you get that. But we have not seen anything more than flashes during his time so far with the Cleveland Browns. He has not looked like a player that's on the cusp of becoming that guy again, or just needs a good run and just hit the high end of his range of outcomes. He has looked like somebody that every now and again will show you a play that reminds you he can be that guy. But outside of that, we have not seen anything like that level in Cleveland.
What do you think is his biggest issue right now? I kind of lean into this idea that I think a lot of it is mental for him, just with the off the field stuff that he was dealing with, the trials, and then he comes back and he has the suspension. He has to sit out a year, plays just the 6 games. Then this past season kind of derailed by the injuries. I think he almost goes out there trying to get it all back at once. He wants to prove to everybody on like one play, hey, I'm still that guy. Do you get the sense that that's true, or what else maybe is holding him back, you think, from trying or from potentially getting back to being that player?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. It has to be mental on the basis that it isn't physical. He still looks like an impressive athlete. He's still got the arm. Every physical tool needed for him to be that good is still there. And nor, I don't think, can you point to the supporting cast and say, look, in one place he had an amazing group around him, and in the other place he doesn't. So, when you take away the supporting cast question, you take away the physical question, all you're left with is mental and the scheme, and whether or not that scheme is tapping into the full breadth of what he can do, and kind of playing to his strengths, or putting him into a system that doesn't really help him, or doesn't really put him in the best position to succeed. I tend to think that it's not a bad offense for him to be the player that he was previously. So you're left with that psychological problem at this point. It's within him, I think, to turn this around and to get back to being the player that he was before.
You mentioned the offensive scheme, and I think it's interesting because we saw this offseason, the Browns go out, they fire Alex Van Pelt, they bring in Ken Dorsey. They're trying to rebuild this offense sort of to the liking of Deshaun Watson. But we've also heard that story before. They kind of went through this exact same thing going into that first year with him. It wasn't quite as apparent because they knew they weren't going to have him until late in the season anyway. But last year they said the same thing. And again, just kind of the varying results. You didn't see the success in the field. And obviously injuries played a role. But now you're going into another year where the Browns are saying, listen, we're building this offense to Deshaun Watson's liking. We're going to try to maximize his talents. I think from the Browns lens of thing, and I think Browns fans kind of feel this is a positive, like, oh, okay, we're getting another guy in here to sort of build it. But is it also maybe alarming that it's now taken another offseason of being like, okay, well, it still didn't work. Now we have to do it a different way again and kind of reinvent the wheel for him and get a new offensive coach in here. Is that alarming at all, you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not a good sign, right? That you're taking another swing at a different offensive scheme. And ultimately, the other complicating factor is all of this lives under the umbrella of Kevin Stefanski, who was the sort of offensive mastermind of this team, right? You're bringing in a head coach like Stefanski because of his offense and because of his prowess. And now, if that's the system that hasn't been to Deshaun Watson's liking, if that's the system that needs to change in order to get the best version of Deshaun Watson, I mean, that's a fundamentally problematic dynamic within the franchise, because that makes a guy like Stefanski, I mean, it doesn't make him pointless, but it like completely chops out the legs of the reason you brought him over there in the first place. And it complicates, so either you're essentially removing him from the equation and saying his scheme can't get it done. We need to modify it and turn it into something else so that the quarterback can be good. Or you're saying, well, Stefanski's system has to remain intact because that's why he's here. And then you're asking any coach that comes in, whether it's Van Pelt, whether it's Ken Dorsey, to sort of modify whatever they do within these guardrails of a Stefanski offense, which itself just doesn't feel like good process, right? So the whole dynamic is messy because the kind of starting point is you have a head coach whose scheme does not seem to function with the quarterback, and both of those guys appear to be sort of locked in like prerequisites to the whole situation, right? Neither of them can leave. That's the coach and it's the quarterback. Then somehow we need to find a way of joining them in the middle. So it's a sort of fundamentally messy starting point, but if you're going to do that, I think you have to keep swinging until something works. So if Van Pelt wasn't the guy that could make that work, let's give it to Ken Dorsey and see if he can find a way of making it work. Like cycling through coordinators is never a good thing, but in this one sort of limited way, it makes sense. It's all you can do. If you can't remove either one of those guys, and you certainly can't remove Deshaun Watson, you can't really remove Kevin Stefanski given the way that the team has gone. The only thing you can do is to try and tinker around the edges and change the intermediary and see if you can find some way of making them mesh.
I think that's really well said, because it alludes to almost this power struggle that we've kind of wondered about within the organization of whose idea was it really to bring in Deshaun? If it wasn't going to be a good fit with Stefanski, what was the point of getting him as your quarterback? But you're right, like within the sample size that we have, they got to try to make it work somehow. And if that means bringing in Ken Dorsey, I think it probably is a fine decision in that regard, because you got to try something to make it work because you're kind of stuck with them. With that in mind, how do you think he will fit in this Ken Dorsey offense that we know is they love to take shots downfield is one of the biggest things that people have harped on with this offense. Just how do you think that could potentially mesh together this year?
Yeah, and I think that does make sense. Deshaun Watson has a good arm. He's always been inclined to take shots down the field. He's got the ability to buy time in the backfield because of his athleticism. So, yeah, I think conceptually I do like that as a connection and as an idea to try and bring that system and hope that you get a better version of Deshaun Watson out of it. I also think that they've got the right receivers to make that happen as well. So I think overall on paper, it is a good combination.
Speaking of the wide receivers, big move this offseason by the Browns to acquire Jerry Jeudy via a trade with the Denver Broncos. He received a 67.8 overall grade from you guys last year, was I think ranked 62nd among his wide receiver contemporaries. He hasn't panned out as the first round talent to this point that I think the Broncos and many others thought he could be. Why do you think Cleveland could potentially be the place that unlocks him, or will they not be the place that unlocks him?
Yeah, I mean, if it's going to work, I think here's a good place to give it a shot. They have the ability that he doesn't need to be a high-level impact player for them. They've got Amari Cooper as the number one guy. Judy can be a complementary piece. They should theoretically have a better functioning passing attack than Denver with the quarterback struggles that they've had. Though, we just talked, it's not like Cleveland's or have been firing on all cylinders either, but at least in theory, that could be an upgrade for them. Judy has shown in the NFL that his traits from college still play. Like his ability to separate, his route running is still exceptional. He's incredibly good at that stuff. But he's not been able to show the consistency with all of the other stuff, and his work at the catch point has been bad. Like we've got a couple of plays here or there where he's gone and shown that he has the ability to go up high and win a catch, a jump ball, contested catch situation, but it's not been his strength at all. In fact, it's been a significant weakness of his. But if he can line up as the second receiver, if he can line up in the slot, use that route running ability to get separation, to target space, and if Deshaun Watson could find him, he could be, a significantly productive number 2 target.
Just want to remind everybody to like, follow, subscribe, and review the Dog Check podcast wherever you get your podcast. We're part of the Bleav network of podcasts, and we're excited this week to be joined by Sam Monson of PFF on the show. Sam, I want to pivot. We spent a lot of time talking about Deshaun. We spent a lot of time talking about the offense already. I want to pivot to the other side of the ball because the Browns defense last year, as you're well aware, was one of the best, if not the best in football. But I always like to say football defenses are kind of like bullpens in baseball, where just year to year they can be so different. And a guy who is maybe super dominant on the mound can maybe regress a little bit, which is why I was a little bit weary of Cleveland's plan this offseason being a lot of let's just retain a lot of the guys from last year. I'm not saying not to do that, but I think sometimes it's good to get some change in there just to kind of keep things fresh. And they added a few different pieces, a few new faces. But without much change on that side of the ball, do you think the Browns can replicate much of the success they had last year and still be one of the best defenses in football?
Yeah, I think they can do that. I mean, a big part of it last year is you're right. There's value in change. And, a guy like Jim Schwartz coming in was a significant change. Some of the additions that they made on the defensive line, significant changes. There's a lot of merit to simply having that kind of turnover year to year and bringing in some fresh ideas or some fresh players. But like last year, not everybody on that defense played anywhere near the kind of peak of their abilities. And I think that's the encouraging thing for this team is they haven't done an awful lot in terms of changing personnel. You've got the occasional addition that you think can come in and play some snaps and make a difference. But I think the majority of the hope will be not everybody in this defense played at a career year level last year. Like the secondary in particular, a huge amount of the bounce back last year was the defensive line became one of the most formidable groups in the NFL. And instead of like they had to cover all day because only Myles Garrett was getting pressure, last year everybody's getting pressure. So now the time they have to cover is shrunk in half and they can be a lot more aggressive and they can make some more plays. But I still think there's a lot more to come from that secondary based off the talent level we've seen of them in the past. And if you get a better version of that group, then maybe there's some regression elsewhere in the defense and it ends up around about the same place.
Do you think the schedule could also be a major impacting factor in terms of some potential regression from that group? Because you look back at last year and like as dominant as they were, we've made note numerous times of some of the quarterbacks that they had to play. Once Joe Burrow got hurt, once some of these other quarterbacks got hurt, you played the Steelers with Kenny Pickett, obviously at the time, and that now has changed with the way they kind of restacked the deck. This year, you got Patrick Mahomes coming to Cleveland. You got Dak Prescott coming to Cleveland. You got some other really good quarterbacks who are going to be making that trip where you're going to be seeing, and just some teams overall that last year were better teams. How much do you think that'll be a factor as well?
Yeah, I mean, the entire AFC North, I think, is dealing with a really tough schedule this year. I think Pittsburgh generally has the toughest schedule in the entire NFL, but I think 3 of the 4 teams in that division are like in the most 5 difficult schedules in football. Yeah. I think the only one that isn't, I think, is Cincinnati got a bit of a break with their bottom place schedule because of the Joe Burrow injury. So, yeah, I think the schedule is absolutely a factor in terms of the season that you can expect, not just the defense to have, but the team overall. It's probably going to be more difficult this year because that entire division is facing a really tough schedule.
Along those lines, though, I always wonder this. I'm curious your thoughts too. Like we harp so much on strength of schedule, and a lot of that's based off of teams' results from the year before. But there's always that stat that gets thrown out that like I think it's like four teams that weren't in the playoffs at all the year before then make the playoffs the next year. So how much stock should we really put in the strength of schedule narrative, knowing that it's based a lot off of the previous year's successes when this year's a completely different slate?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different ways of looking at strength, looking at the schedule, right? Number one, there's the old way that everybody did, the classic strength of schedule, which, as you said, is based off last year, and we know
Yeah.
there's such a huge amount of turnover year to year. It's the worst way of looking at it. Now, I think a lot of people are looking at, the Vegas win totals, the projected win totals of a team for this year. So you at least have those are going to be wrong as well, right? There are teams that come out of nowhere. There are teams that are expected to be good, like if a quarterback goes down 4 snaps in, like last year, your projected win total goes out the window in week one. So those aren't going to be deadly accurate either, but they're better than just looking at last year and saying that's who the team is. But the other two elements I think that are really important are rest days and travel distance. Anything that's going to mess with the schedule in the course of a week. And those, I think, can vary wildly and are not given the same kind of attention that just the teams you're facing are. And the NFL, I don't know if they're doing it consciously or not, but they're kind of getting in under the radar a wildly unfair competitive disadvantage to the schedule in those ways, in travel time and just days of rest and those kinds of things. So I think those are the areas the teams need to start focusing on way more than just who are the teams we're going to be playing, which we've known, all the way along. Like we know that already.
Well, and to your point, I think that's why the Steelers, like you mentioned earlier, probably maybe the toughest schedule in football next year. Just the NFL did them no favors, especially with that late, final like 8 games of the season slate that they have. I want to go back to the Browns defense for a second, Sam, because speaking of that group, obviously highlighted by Myles Garrett and the 2023 campaign that he netted himself his first Defensive Player of the Year award. Browns fans, I think, actually have you guys over at PFF to thank for helping him get that honor, because PFF provided, I think, a lot of the advanced evidence, beyond just checking box scores as to why he won Defensive Player of the Year. Has he reached out to you guys and sent you a thank you letter yet for your help in getting him the award?
No, he's not. We haven't heard from Myles, but we'll he deserved it last year. I mean, it wasn't just us, but Micah Parsons said Myles Garrett was Defensive Player of the Year. And Micah Parsons had himself a Defensive Player of the Year type of candidacy. Like he had a strong case himself. But the PFF data, things like pass rush win rate, it does a good job of showing some of the reasons why. But all that is essentially is quantifying the tape, and if you're watching the tape, you see that Myles Garrett is basically unblockable last season if he has any amount of time to work with. And the difference between him and some players that had more sacks or, more impact plays is not what he's doing. It's simply whether or not he got the opportunity to rush for long enough, whether he had 2.5 seconds on a given play to get home and make that play, or whether the ball came out of the quarterback's hands before he had a chance to get there. And these are things that are not in his control, but are things that completely change the number of sacks a guy's going to get in a given season.
Do you guys take pride in that, though? Like the fact that, your site in general, but also metrics like you mentioned, pass rush, win rate, have reached such status in today's football zeitgeist that it's actually helping determine, awards winners, and that people are citing it in their analysis for a matchup on a weekly basis. How much pride do you guys take in that?
I mean, it's nice that we're now like that's the discussion, right? It may be frustrating when you're having the argument, but you don't have to go back very far to find like the argument would simply be between two guys with, the top two guys in terms of sacks. And then we'd be arguing, but 3 of them came against a bad offensive tackle. That's just not a good way of measuring like who was the best player in a given season. The fact that we've developed and moved on from that to a discussion about, well, what is more valuable? A guy that gets, more impact plays, but at a much lower rate, or a guy that has way more kind of positive plays, but didn't get the impact plays. And we obviously sided with Myles Garrett and said overall the net is that he was the better player versus a guy like TJ Watt. But it's absolutely a reasonable conversation to have for Steelers fans to say, look, the sacks, the turnovers, those are bigger plays than the ones Myles Garrett were making overall. And he had more of them. And somewhere there's a balance, right? And that essentially is the argument, is where is that tipping point between those higher valuable plays and the more positive plays at a lower value. And, our determination is that the tipping point was in Myles Garrett's favor, but that is a reasonable and high level discussion to be having, as opposed to, well, this guy with one more sack should get defensive player of the year. So I think absolutely there's, it's a good feeling. I think that is the discussion has moved on to that level.
On the flip side of that, though, and maybe the Steelers fans' perspective of this provides the alternative perspective, where you get a lot of people who still doubt you guys and say, "Oh, it's just a bunch of nerds in mom's basement trying to, grade players, and they've never played football in their lives." I guess, listen, I think what you guys do is obviously, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of time. And I think the fact that we now have metrics that, and listen, like, nothing's an exact science, but especially in sports, but I think the fact that we have metrics now that can kind of give us some more context of things is important. But obviously there's still people out there that are the doubters. What do you guys say in response to those players sometimes, especially who come out and sort of push back against what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of players that sound off about it are either guys that don't have a good grade and are therefore understandably annoyed, or simply players that don't like people outside of the building commenting on anything, right? And that's not a PFF specific thing. It's why they also don't like, journalists necessarily commenting, or
Very true,
like anybody outside of the building. Like, even you hear this all the time, players railing against comments made by former players, right? Just because they're not in the building, they don't know. Like, you if you're not in the building, you do lose a certain amount of information, but it doesn't mean you can't comment on anything that happens within it. Like, the bottom line there is that players simply do not like anybody from outside of their organization talking about their job. And I don't think that's necessarily specific to players. Like, people, like anybody who is being commented from the outside thinks that the person making that comment, they don't know what they're talking about. They're not in the building. Like, you shouldn't be able to comment on what we're doing, whether it's football players, whether it's, a business, whether it's, commercial decisions, anything. Like, it's just a natural part of human nature. You don't like somebody from outside of your tent lobbing stones inside.
It's well said. And like I said, I certainly appreciate what you guys do, and I think there's some value in it. So hopefully most of the NFL players are on board. But you're right. I certainly think there's a human element there. I just want to end with a couple more questions for you, Sam, more so revolving around the AFC North in general, sort of away from the Browns. And I'll start with this one. Lamar Jackson, in his MVP season last year, was your guys' third highest graded quarterback in 2023. There's been this story, though, this offseason about how he's cut his weight down to, I think, around like 212 pounds in an attempt to kind of be able to separate a little bit more in open space. Do you think that's a wise move for Lamar? Because now people are a little bit worried about it, just his playing weight and his ability to withstand hits.
Yeah, I don't know there's a ton of difference, to be honest. Like, I'm not there. The data on quarterback size versus injuries is very sketchy because it's very difficult to get a control. Generally speaking, there is actually an inverse correlation between size and injury rate, meaning that the bigger quarterbacks actually get hurt more often than the smaller ones, which doesn't mean that a bigger quarterback taking the same hit that a smaller quarterback takes is going to get hurt more often. The thing is that it's a playing style thing, right? Like, the bigger quarterbacks tend to expose themselves to bigger hits and therefore get hurt more often, whereas the smaller quarterbacks know they can't take those hits, so they don't take them. Like, they're better protecting themselves, essentially. So what you never get is the A/B analysis of, well, what happens if we get Lamar Jackson and he plays at 190 pounds, at 205 pounds, at 220 pounds? Like, which version of Lamar Jackson is going to get injured less often? And you never have any idea. The bottom line, though, is I think it probably doesn't matter, and that Lamar Jackson's ability to protect himself has always been pretty good. And even though he's had quite a lot of injuries, for the amount that they use him in the run game, he's always been pretty decent at protecting himself. It's not like if you go back to Michael Vick, every time he took off scrambling, the commentators would be like, somebody needs to teach that guy to slide because he's going to get himself hurt. Like that happened every single time.
Yeah.
Michael Vick took off. You don't get that as much with Lamar Jackson. He is pretty good at keeping himself healthy and protecting himself. So I think the difference between him playing in terms of playing weight is probably marginal. It doesn't make much of a difference either way.
And from the Ravens quarterback room to the Steelers revamped quarterback room, should Browns fans be worried about the way that they've kind of remodeled this group, starting with veteran Russell Wilson, who had a decent year last year as more kind of, I know people labeled him kind of a game manager style of play. And do you think he plays the entire season, or at some point do you think the Steelers maybe pivot to Justin Fields?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible that they end up giving Fields a shot at some point, but I think either guy upgrades the quarterback room they had a year ago. And the way that they've done it, I think has been really good. They're paying Russell Wilson almost nothing. He counts against their salary cap for less than $1 million, I think, or just over $1 million. Yeah. Justin Fields is for like $6 million. Like that's a very cheap quarterback room now for two players that should either one of them upgrade what they had a year ago. So I think process wise, it's a really smart thing to do. It's up in the air what the Russell Wilson, Arthur Smith combination is going to look like, a bit like the conversation we had before with Stefanski's offense and Deshaun Watson. You can kind of paint a picture where it actually plays to Russell Wilson's strengths really well. You can also paint a picture where it's the exact worst offense you could put him in, because Arthur Smith likes to target the middle of the field, and Russell Wilson has never targeted the middle of the field particularly well, regardless of what offense he's been put in. So I think it remains to be seen how successful that combination will be. But Justin Fields is there on the sideline as an alternative option if they want to go in that different direction. And, as much as people are writing off Fields as a quarterback that could be successful, like he has improved every year of his career and improved as a passer every year of his career in a system that, was pretty bad, or the system and the support cast was pretty bad for most of his time in Chicago. So, it's definitely possible that Fields is still a reclamation project that can turn around.
Some incredible analysis throughout this entire episode from Sam Monson of PFF. Sam, I'm going to give you the floor real quick here just to let people know where they can find you and some of the fun things that you're working on over at PFF right now.
Yeah, just the PFF NFL podcast, either on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.
Sam, I can't thank you enough for being part of the show this week. Let's plan on doing this again down the line, hopefully throughout the season, and talking about some Browns football, and among other things. I appreciate you, man.
Sounds good. Anytime. Take it easy.
As for you, our fine listeners and viewers of the program, I just want to remind you to like, follow, subscribe, and review the Dog Check podcast wherever you get your podcasts, part of the Bleav network of podcasts, and we also air weekly on Bally Sports Great Lakes. As always, we appreciate you tuning in. I'll talk to you guys next week. And as always, go Browns.